Welcome, everybody, to this part of the San Antonio Book Festival. Thank you so much to the festival for having me. My name is Piper Kerman, and I'm so delighted to be talking today with Maurice Chammah about his amazing book, Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty. How are you today,
I'm
Maurice?
good. I'm good. Great to be here. Thanks so much for doing this conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Good. And of course, it's so appropriate that we're talking with at the San Antonio Book Festival because your book focuses on Texas to talk about the peculiar American approach to the death penalty. So, the book is tremendous. I really have to commend you on making really difficult, troubling material. Um, Something that many, many different people from many different points of view and different experiences can come to. And the book puts forward both the rise and also the interesting decline of the death penalty in a way that is very approachable. And I commend you also on not making it something that is so disturbing and deadening that you have to put the book aside. So we can talk in a moment about how you accomplish that remarkable feat as a writer. But I wanted to dive right in, as I thought about this incredible book and how to tackle this topic in our relatively short time to talk. There's so much to talk about. We'll speak in a moment about how you chart the rise and the fall of this public policy of state execution. But I have to flag the point that many folks who are listening right now may be thinking about a very recent execution spree. So, starting only in July of last year, 2020, the federal government rushed to execute 13 people who were on federal death row, which was, I think, an unprecedented rush to execution on the part of the federal government. And it was met with great concern from lots of people who have been steadfast opponents of the death penalty, but also people who perhaps were not caught up in that fight, but who noticed some of the problems with those individual cases. And one of them that was particularly profound to me was a woman named Lisa Montgomery, who was executed by the federal government. And Lisa committed a terrible murder and kidnapping, a truly horrifying crime. But Lisa's experience was one that frankly mirrored that of many, many people who end up on death row, meaning that she had a childhood of almost unimaginable abuse, neglect. She was abused in almost every way that a child could possibly be abused, and that abuse continued throughout her adult life until she committed her crime. She then spent, many, many years incarcerated and was without a doubt mentally ill. And yet the state decided to go forward with her murder, her state-sanctioned killing. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you think gender relates to the death penalty in the course of your research on this project. I think when I think of Texas, I also think of Karla Faye Tucker, who I believe was the last woman that was put to death in Texas. Correct me if I'm mistaken.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
Yeah. And so how does that work out? The vast majority of people on the row are men. But in many states that have the death penalty, there may be just one or a handful of women who are on death row. Can you talk a little bit about the way that gender plays out in relation to the penalty?
Sure, absolutely. So I should hop back to what you were saying before quickly about the sort of unprecedented spree of federal executions under President Trump. I think what was so striking to me is that it raised public awareness of the death penalty in a way that it had not been raised in at least a decade. For most of the time that I was researching the book, it felt as though the death penalty was sort of out of public attention. There were executions. Occasionally, a case would come along and sort of make the news cycle, but it was never nearly, sort of as much as it did when Trump sought to sort of put all these executions in a very short span of time. And What I noticed about that spree was that the way that it was covered in the media and the way that it was greeted by the public was very different than it would have been 20 or 30 years before. It was, Texas executed far more people than the Trump administration had in this one year, on any given month or year of the late 90s, early 2000s, and it never reached public attention in quite the same way. And you often saw in the way that the media would cover those cases, it would be, well, let's look at the really awful crime that this person committed, and then let's kind of quote some prosecutors, quote some police officers who investigated the crime, and sort of show the public why this person is a monster. Fast forward 20 years, and the emphasis is much more on what are the problems with these cases. So in the case of Lisa Montgomery, she committed an incredibly horrible crime, but as you said, she also herself suffered tremendous trauma as a child. There was another case under Trump where it was a terrible crime, but the person being executed had played a relatively minor role in the crime. He had driven the getaway car, so to speak, and there was this question of whether really someone who had done something so minor should really be put to death over it. Another man committed a terrible crime, but he was black and had an all-white jury. So you have these different kind of lenses on the cases that were sort of much more about their problems and about what was sort of troubling about them than you would have seen 20 or 30 years earlier. That said, throughout the whole history, this kind of rise and fall that I chart in the book, I found that the cases of women on death row, and particularly the executions of women, played a sort of a role that was kind of bigger symbolically than it was practically speaking, insofar as there were very few cases of women, but almost all of them were sort of a big deal to the public. They were something that people paid attention to, made the news. None more famously than Karla Faye Tucker, who was executed in Texas in 1998. By the time that her execution came, she had already been in the news many times. The crime had taken place in Houston many years before. It was really awful as a crime. She had, during a robbery, left a pickaxe in the chest of one of the victims, just these sort of stomach-turning details, right? And then while she was on death row, she had this very dramatic conversion to Christianity. She became a born-again Christian and became quite famous in evangelical circles. She was on the 700 Club, and other Christian broadcasting, radio and TV. And then it got to the point where Larry King flew to Gatesville, Texas, where she was on women's death row, and he interviewed her. And I found the transcript of that interview, and it was fascinating because she herself understood sort of how symbolically important it was that she was a woman being executed. And she said to Larry King, when people think about women, they often have a protective urge. She kind of invoked chivalry. She said, well, in the Titanic, what did they say when it was going down? Women and children first. And there was this sort of a little bit maybe patronizing, but also sort of chivalry-oriented way of thinking about women. And that meant that when a woman was actually facing the death penalty, it sort of made people uncomfortable. It made them question, no matter how bad the thing this person has done, how do we actually think that it's legitimate to put them to death? And more specifically, is the person that we're putting to death really the person who committed the crime, right? The Karla Faye Tucker that murdered these victims, and the Karla Faye Tucker who was this kind of bright-eyed and cheery, kind, sort of Christ-infused personality, she looked very different. Those two personalities were very different, and it raised this question of whether by the time someone gets executed, have they changed their life so much that that execution is really sort of an injustice. And so then after that, it was mostly executions of men around the country. But I think that case was a kind of a high watermark. It came at the peak of the death penalty, both in Texas and nationally. And it started, I think, the decline insofar as it led people to question the punishment more than they would have in a case of a man. And then fast forward 20 years, the case of Lisa Montgomery comes along, and it plays kind of a similar role. Of the 13 executions that took place under Trump, I would argue that Lisa Montgomery's execution was the most famous. It's the name most likely to have reached your average person who doesn't spend all day thinking about the death penalty or criminal justice. And I think that what was troubling about that case opened the door for a lot of people in 2021 to say, I haven't thought about the death penalty as a public policy decision in a while. Do I still stand by where I stood 10 or 15 or 20 years ago? Am I still comfortable with this? Do I still think that it's appropriate to execute people no matter how terrible the crime they may have committed?
Mm. It's worth it to point out that both Carla Faye Tucker and Lisa Montgomery are white women, and
Mm.
that white women are afforded humanity, which is denied to black women and also to black men. And that's so present in the death penalty. So let's turn our attention specifically to Texas. So Texas, I believe we've had just a few more than 1,000, I think it's 1,563 executions since 1975 in this country. And Texas accounts for more than 500 of those executions. So much in the way that that sort of killing spree happened just in the last, several months here at the federal government. Texas has been putting people to death at a pace that is incomparable. And that, I believe, is one of the reasons that you chose to focus on Texas in Let the Lord Sort Them. It bears note that the places that are still most inclined to impose the death penalty coincide greatly with the places in this country where other public killings have been notorious, and that's lynching. And I just wanted to share this quote from Craig Washington, who you talk about in the book. And he was a Texas lawmaker, and he was trying to help his colleagues see why not to reinstate the death penalty back in the 1970s. And he said, a true history of the death penalty in his country and in his state, Texas, lay not in Revolutionary era hangings, nor in a gauzy vision of the frontier, but in the horrors of Southern lynching. And I think that you draw that out early in the book, the fact, and if you look at the maps of where lynchings have taken place in this country, and the Equals Justice Initiative has a profound number of online tools and also an incredible memorial to peace and justice in Montgomery, Alabama, you see that across the country, lynchings map up almost perfectly with the counties that are still most inclined to impose the death penalty. And there were 338 documented lynchings in Texas. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the relationship between race and the death penalty.
Sure. I mean, it is a fraught and long-standing relationship. As I write in the book, before the death penalty sort of took over in American life in the way that it did over the last 50 years, there was the Jim Crow era, which sort of was itself right after the era of slavery. And all of these eras were kind of marked by different ways of managing how society was going to sort of create a caste system and devalue Black Americans, right? And one of the ways that happened in the Jim Crow era primarily was through lynchings, which have had many different definitions over the years, but primarily were mob attacks and extrajudicial in the sense that they were not legally sanctioned by the state, although in many cases there was a kind of tacit agreement or oversight of a sheriff or a district attorney. And what I found in the book is that, I used to think, well, there was going to be the era of lynchings and then there's the era of the death penalty and there's a line between them and I need to explain what that line is. But as I got deeper into the research, I realized that the line was actually quite fluid, that there were cases that sort of looked both like lynchings and looked like the death penalty. An example I tell in the book that I find myself always basically telling people to illustrate this connection is there was a case of a man named Dick Garrett who was accused of killing a law enforcement officer while trying to escape. He was going to be arrested for something more minor, and he ended up killing this officer. And I should say we don't really know because what happened was he was tried. He went on trial and was going to face the death penalty. His trial lasted 4 hours, and while he was in the courtroom, he could hear saws and hammers outside the courtroom because on the courthouse square they were already building a scaffold to hang him. His jury, which was all white residents of the town, convicted him, almost instantly, and he was put to death, the same day. And that was a legal process of him getting a trial and maybe a brief appeal and an execution, but it looks an awful lot like the lynchings that also were going on at the same time. And so the line between these categories was very fluid. Then over the course of the 1920s and 30s, a lot of states, including Texas, there's a kind of societal embarrassment about these public executions, and they take them indoors. And as the kind of public bloodlust is tempered through the sort of policy decision to put it behind closed doors, you also see that race slowly gets sort of pulled out of the rhetoric. So in lynchings, many of the participants would be explicit that we are going to lynch a black man for often the murder of a white woman. And this is going back to what you were saying about the way in which white women were sort of valued over and above black people in some of these even more recent cases. In these older cases, it was explicit that white women are victims and black men are perpetrators and monsters, and we need to lynch them so that others are afraid and won't commit these crimes. This is the rhetoric you hear. But then you get into the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 20th century, the role of race kind of gets sublimated. And so instead of in the courtroom saying those black people or using the N-word or something more explicit, the prosecutors say, those people, aren't you afraid at night when you walk down the street because those people are going to come get you? And of course, they can then say, well, I'm not making this about race. It's sort of akin to how, in the 1960s and 70s when, the Willie Horton ad was the sort of famous, during a presidential campaign, an ad that tried to tag Michael Dukakis as friendly to criminals. George Bush's campaign could say, well, this isn't about race. He's just a criminal. But of course, it's a black man. His face is put up on the television screen, and it really is clearly about race. But the role of race gets sort of quietly sublimated in the discourse about it.
And those dog whistles can be pretty noisy, but
they're
yes,
noisy to us in 2021 looking back, right? But there's a lot of like, at the time people can say, well, it's not race, and there's ways out basically rhetorically. And I think that the whole history of the death penalty and race in America has been one in which race kind of gets sublimated. I'll also say that I think Texas has played a particular role in sublimating race because Texas has offered a kind of different mythology to Americans that explains lynchings not as mob killings of black men in the courthouse square, but rather of a bunch of cowboys who need to hang a cattle rustler from the nearest tree because it's the frontier, and this is just what we need to do because the judge is somewhere far away, and we don't have the luxury of a full trial, right? So Texas has sort of offered to Americans a way to kind of excuse ourselves when it comes to lynchings in our history by making it seem like it wasn't about race.
And yet, again, the data shows literally in black and white that that's not true, that black people are much more likely to receive the death penalty than anybody else, and that a person when someone who is killed who is white, the killer is more likely to receive the death penalty than if they kill a black person or another BIPOC person.
That's correct.
And also, when you look again at the map of Texas, there is this concentration of both the history of lynchings and also of the death penalty in the eastern part of the state. I mean, you can quite literally look at the mapping and see it. So this migration of violence from, in theory, extralegal violence via lynching to state violence that is enshrined within the criminal legal system takes place. And then in 1972, the state, tell us about what in some ways is sort of the beginning of the rise portion, the first half of your book. Talk to us about what the Supreme Court did and what Texas and many other states then did in response.
Sure. So when I started researching this book, or really when I started learning about the death penalty as a journalist, 10 years ago, I had assumed that the death penalty was something that had always sort of been with us. I knew that certain states like Texas were used it more, but I thought of it as just a kind of static reality in American history. And that is not the case. America almost did away with the death penalty in the 1960s. It virtually disappeared around the country. A group of civil rights lawyers based in New York were very successful in aggressively trying to stop executions by going to courts. And this led to 1972 when the US Supreme Court took a series of cases from Georgia and Texas, and in those cases declared that the entire death penalty system in the US violated the Constitution, that whether you got the death penalty or not was completely arbitrary, and they compared it to being struck by lightning, that many different people could commit murders with very similar circumstances, and only one would get the death penalty, and there was no logic to why it was that one person. And to the extent there was logic, it had to do with troubling things like race and gender, right?
Or literally with zip code. I mean, there are simply like places in this country where the death penalty, is more likely to be imposed, and places where it's not likely at all. And that was true during the period that you were researching.
It was absolutely. And it's worth saying that we, were talking before about the connection between counties that carried out lynchings and counties that carried out death sentences. It's also worth noting that sometimes it has to do with something more banal, which is how much money the county has, right? Harris County, where Houston is, Bexar County, where San Antonio is, all of these cities have sent more people to death row, not just because there are more murders in those towns, but disproportionately more because the prosecutors' offices have the resources to seek death sentences, which is a very expensive thing to do. That's a long story. It's in the book, and we can talk about it. But going back to this question of what happened in the 70s, 72, the Supreme Court says it's arbitrary, but they don't say the death penalty can never exist again in America. They just say any state that wants to have the death penalty has to rewrite its laws and create some logic to who's going to get the death penalty. And more than half the states said about this. Some states which have not had the death penalty in many years, like Michigan and Vermont, just didn't, try to bring it back. But Texas and Georgia, throughout the South and the West, and even some of the Northeast, New York did it too. State legislatures got to work on trying to write these laws. And in the book, I tell the story of Texas's journey doing this. It was the 1973 session of the Texas legislature. By sort of journalistic luck, many of the legislators who did that work were very young. They were elected, kind of swept into office still in their 20s. And that meant that when I came along 40, 50 years later, many of them were still alive and in good health and willing to talk about their memories of that session. And they wrote a law that was sort of unique. And I won't get into all the legal weeds on why it was unique. It's an interesting story, but it meant that the Texas death penalty system was especially harsh and especially likely to send people to death row. And part of that was because the law said, and it still says today, that in order to get the death penalty, the jury has to decide that you are going to be dangerous in the future, that you're likely to be a, quote, continuing threat to society. And that means that a member of the jury has to hear the facts about the case and a person, a defendant in front of them, and essentially purport to predict the future, which of course is impossible. And
yet, I mean, Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative has spoken so eloquently about the assumption of dangerousness that is imposed from birth and throughout, their lives on Black men and also on Black women, but particularly on Black men. And we see that play out when we look at Trayvon Martin or any number of other young people who have lost their lives simply because of the color of their skin.
It's true. And I think one of the haunting moments for me in the research for the book and the interviewing was when I talked to a woman named Peggy Davis, who is, I mean, she's a law professor at NYU, but at the time in the 1970s, she was a young lawyer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York, and she was working on the legal strategy where they would try to attack these new laws, like the one in Texas, in court. And she described to me reading the Texas law as it had just been passed, seeing this emphasis on who's going to be dangerous in the future, and thinking, oh no, this is going to be about race, isn't it? Right? Like there was just this, like, she's a black woman, and it was like obvious to her, right? And all these mostly white legislators who worked on the bill were not thinking about race consciously. They may have been having it in the back of their minds unconsciously, right? And this is, of course, not unique to the death penalty. This is true of so much of American life, where bias is implicit and it takes a while to become explicit. And this is part of what can be so insidious about racism. So Peggy Davis sort of sees the future coming, and then the future comes to pass. Texas death row becomes disproportionately black and Latino, and there are also many white men on death row as well. But the Texas law is written in such a way and then approved by the Supreme Court in 1976, and this is what really sets up the next 40 years, where every other state, many other states have the death penalty, but Texas has it in an especially intensive way. And part of how I describe that is that all the different aspects of the conveyor belt to death row and to execution are kind of working in lockstep. So in some other state, in California, say, you may have liberal state Supreme Court justices or a liberal governor who are a little uncomfortable with executions and are willing to slow the process down and not carry out as many. Or in another state, maybe there's a federal judge who's slowing it down, but in Texas, nobody is slowing it down. And so part of why Texas becomes the epicenter of the death penalty is not just that we have a cultural attachment to it, it's that we have the absence of any barriers to slowing it down. Everybody sees it as their identity as a Texan to kind of speed the process up.
So one of the things that I think is important and really comes through in the book is what's behind that drive to, so in 1972, Supreme Court, makes the death penalty unconstitutional, but leaves the door open for its return. And right away, people get to work in Texas, and you illuminate that process in the book, and in other places in the country as well, to figure out how to make it constitutional again. And that's a really important point, because when we widen the lens, when we say, why is the death penalty important above and beyond individual lives, and our ideas about state-sanctioned killing, our ideas about the incredible number of people who have been exonerated from death row. More than 180, I think, have been exonerated from death row since 1975. When we widen that lens and we look at why does the United States have such a uniquely punitive criminal legal system in comparison with other democracies? And, the death penalty is, of course, the ultimate penalty. But we also have, we're also the only democracy that sentences children to die in prison and in the form of juvenile life without parole. We incarcerate literally 1/3 of the world's incarcerated women. So, Oklahoma is literally the #1 incarcerator of women in the world because it has the highest incarceration rate for women. We have this incredibly punitive system, and it is profoundly tied to race and to, the mechanisms under which colonialism, settler colonialism, and the extermination of Native people happened. But what goes on, on a personal level, on a political level, in 1976, that drive to get it back, to get this very symbolic tool, this symbolic home of retribution is the death penalty. So, characterize that a little bit more to us about that first half of the book in The Rise. And I remember actually, well, I'll come back to this in a moment. There's one particular part of the book that I thought really stood out. But, I think this is important to understand, not just to understand the death penalty, but also these other factors in our criminal legal system.
Yeah, that's right. When I started the research, a few people in my world. So my day job is that I'm a writer for the Marshall Project, which is a small nonprofit. Well, I used to say small. We're growing, but it's a nonprofit news outlet that covers criminal justice issues. And I write about a lot of things other than the death penalty. And in my kind of universe of sources and other journalists, I did hear people say, "Well, why are you focused so much on the death penalty? It's actually a tiny, tiny part of the larger system." Um, I mean, more people die in prison just in general in a given year because we incarcerate many people for life and they die of old age in prison. Uh, Far more people die that way than do of execution. So why this emphasis? And I have come in sort of looking at the death penalty in particular and the system more broadly to feel and to argue that the death penalty punches above its weight symbolically insofar as it is the most extreme thing that we as a society can do to somebody who has committed a crime. And it's our way of saying this person is not redeemable. And
Mm.
this, I want to highlight how radical that is because in so many other areas of our life, we do have a tendency to see people as redeemable no matter what they've done. It undergirds so much of our kind of Christian, heritage as a country where I mean, a lot of politicians are always kind of invoking the example of Jesus and forgiveness, both on the left and the right. So it's in our kind of cultural DNA to see some kind of forgiveness. Many of our prison systems are still called the Department of Corrections. There's this idea, at least, a vestige of some old, hope that the point of this system was to correct something. Sort of what exactly that is might have been fuzzy. But the idea of rehabilitation really used to be a bigger part of our prison system, and that fell away in the 1960s and 70s. And there's a lot of reasons why, but I think the return of the death penalty is sort of at the heart of that story because it was the moment that we as a country said we are committed to the idea that there are some people who aren't redeemable. And once we opened the door to that idea through the death penalty, it made a lot of other punishments, which would have seemed really harsh, somehow seem a little less harsh by comparison. And I often think of like almost a trickle down effect where because you have the death penalty, sentencing someone to life without parole seems like the less punitive thing to do. But of course, if you didn't have the death penalty, life without parole would seem, as it does in Europe, abhorrently punitive, right?
Mm. Yeah.
But I think what was happening in the 60s and 70s is that crime was going up. And I focus in this book, I tried to kind of come up with a handful of cultural touchstones that people might remember if they were alive at the time. And one of them was the movie Dirty Harry, where you'll remember Dirty Harry is played by Clint Eastwood, and he's on the trail of a purported serial killer. And at one point, he gets his man and then has to let him go because he got evidence without a warrant. And there's this sense
Mhm.
of the Supreme Court is this sort of evil institution up in Washington that's letting the bad guys go. And at the time that this death penalty decision I described happened in 1972, there was a real backlash to the civil rights movement and an idea that the civil rights movement was sort of being used to give criminals a pass. Because the Supreme Court had ruled not just in the death penalty, but Miranda warnings were a new idea. The idea that you have a right to counsel, the idea that police can't just go seize evidence without a warrant. All these decisions were happening, and there was this idea, and it was really especially prevalent in the South as times were changing and white supremacy was really being challenged, that one of the ways in which white supremacy was being challenged was Washington sending down these edicts about how we run our society as
Mm.
the white majority. And I think that part of why there was such fervor to bring back the death penalty was a part of that backlash because it was something, it's not like a state legislature could go back and undo the Miranda decision or some of these other things that the Supreme Court was saying, but they could bring back the death penalty. It was like the one thing they could do to say to the public, we're doing something to maintain your desire for safety, which, of course, as we've said, was a very racially coded thing at the time.
Yeah. And, the imposition, it's interesting that you tie sort of Christianity. I always think about it more in terms of monotheism, but like all monotheistic religions are incredibly hierarchical, and that ties back into the death penalty and the way that we think about our criminal legal system in this country in really profound ways as not a circle of the community coming together and making a decision together about someone who's caused harm, but rather this hierarchical approach. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that I find hopeful, which are the second book, which is The Fall. So the book is framed as the rise and fall of the death penalty. So, something begins to change. So Texas, again, has imposed the death penalty more than 500 times, out of, literally close to 1/3 of the executions have been in Texas. And yet, even in Texas, things do begin to shift. In the book, I think you really draw out the personal journeys of people who are involved, with fascinating characters, including a judge who plays a really critical part of the book, including a woman who works hard on mitigation. And mitigation is a really important part of what you talk about in the book. Can you elucidate a little bit? Can you explain what mitigation is in relation to the death penalty and what you saw in your research?
Sure. And that reminds me to sort of say that I often feel like when I'm talking about the book, it can feel as though the book is going to be very abstract, and that it's mostly, these Supreme Court cases and these philosophical ideas and these political shifts. But my goal was very much to have it be a book about people, where you sort of get to know individuals who can kind of carry you into the world of the death penalty. And in particular, in the book, there are two women who kind of frame, I feel like, the kind of overarching arc of the book. The first is Dana Lynn Reeser, who is a defense lawyer. When you meet her at the beginning, she's young and coming out of law school and very committed to trying to fight the death penalty. She's very much actually in the same world as Bryan Stevenson, who we've mentioned a few times. They kind of came of age in a similar era where being a lawyer who opposed the death penalty was a tremendously unpopular thing to do. It was akin in many people's minds to defending the worst terrorists, the 9/11 hijackers. Like, there was this idea that you were kind of a proxy to evil if you defended these people in court, right? The other woman in the book is Elsa Alcala, who starts her career as a prosecutor. She sends several men to death row, and then she becomes a judge. And as a judge, she comes to question the death penalty. And I wanted people to understand that sort of by the end of the book, it sort of takes the Dana Lynn Reesers to bring the Elsa Alcalas along. It takes those sort of true believers who always believed that the people on death row have some humanity and we need to fight for that humanity. And then 20, 30 years later, she's convincing these sort of Republican prosecutors who become judges to come to her side in terms of seeing the humanity of these people. So the main story that I tell very late in the book to illustrate that is a case that Dana Lynn worked on. It's kind of her best known professional success as a defense lawyer. It was a pretty famous case at the time in Houston in the mid-2000s. A man named Juan Quintero was an undocumented immigrant who one night when he was pulled over shot a police officer. In addition to killing this police officer, he was here undocumented, as I mentioned, and he had been accused in the past of sexual assault. He had also been arrested many times for driving while intoxicated. And so really on every level, he was kind of the least sympathetic criminal defendant one could imagine going on trial in Houston, which at the time was still the epicenter of the death penalty. It's a book about Texas, but Houston is the extreme even for Texas. Houston's been responsible for more death sentences and executions than many entire states in the country. So in that situation, Dana Lynn Reeser manages to convince a jury to spare Juan Quintero's life, and she does it by mounting what's called a mitigation investigation. Mitigation comes from the idea that there are mitigating circumstances to this crime that should lessen the punishment. And in order to build her case, she sends researchers into Mexico, where he's from, into Texas, where he spent some of his life. And they interview hundreds of people. They can collect thousands and thousands of school records, hospital records. They find out that he was abused as a young man by his father very severely, that he fled to the US for a better life, that he was very religious, that he struggled with alcoholism, that he had a brain injury at a young age. And all of these different disparate aspects of his life are not meant to excuse the crime or say, well, he didn't really know what he was doing. They're to give the jury enough reasons to kind of see him with a more merciful eye and say, maybe I still personally believe in the death penalty, but this man clearly has had some struggles in his life, and I don't really think he deserves it, even though he did something quite terrible. And the story I try to tell in the book is that after enough cases like that, after defense lawyers like Dana Lynn win life sentences instead of death sentences for enough of their clients, the death penalty starts to just kind of go away. And now Texas sentences less than 10, sometimes even less than 5 people to death row per year. And it used to be dozens of people per year. And part of that is because the defense lawyers have managed to bring along jurors who are members of the public like us, and also judges like Elsa Alcala, who I described, who are slowing down executions because they see the problems more clearly than they used to. And so it kind of takes all kinds to get the decline of the death penalty.
So one of the things about that case specifically that was so interesting to me, you talk about one of the jurors in the case and his deep ambivalence in the wake of the conclusion of the case, and he does not receive the death penalty. And I feel like that's reflected in the public debate still that goes on. I think about Nebraska, which has flip-flopped in terms of abolishing the death penalty. So you clearly document that in pragmatic terms, the death penalty is waning. It is going away, and yet it's still on the books, including in many states that have not had an execution in many, many decades, or in some cases ever. And Nebraska, again, abolished and then flip-flop. I think it's flip-flopped either once or twice. And that ambivalence also seemed to be reflected in the mind of that juror who had been had been for the death penalty and had essentially changed his vote in the case. In that case, what's your opinion before we turn to questions? Because we have actually a number of questions and we're close to being wrapped up. But what's your opinion about the prospect for abolition of the death penalty as opposed to its continuing to wilt and to fade?
I think that the death penalty will continue to wilt and fade as it has. It will, more and more states will decide to abandon it. I mean, very recently, Virginia abolished the death penalty. It was the first Southern state to do so. Joe Biden has said that he's going to work to abolish it at the federal level. Ohio and some other states have bills to do it. A lot of these bills are also, it's worth mentioning, sponsored by Republicans, which is, I think, a big generational shift from 20 years ago. But there's sort of 2 reasons why I think it's going to be a while. I mean, on the one hand, even if the death penalty disappeared tomorrow, life without parole has become a much more common sentence. And I think for many people, it is akin to the death penalty insofar as you are being sentenced to die in prison. It's just that it's going to be of a disease or old age or the coronavirus, frankly, than it is of execution. And that suggests that America has not really turned away fully from a kind of the punitiveness that animated the death penalty. So I think that's a question mark that's going to keep existing. And then I think the thing that will keep the death penalty around for a lot of people, and I really think a lot about nowadays, is that when we think about which cases galvanize the public for in terms of a kind of punitive urge or sort of a public outcry of this person deserves the worst punishment, there are still cases, and there are cases that even I think are especially troubling to people on the left who traditionally oppose the death penalty. I'm thinking of hate crimes. When Dylan Roof gunned down churchgoers in South Carolina and was sent to federal death row, there were some diehard anti-death penalty activists who were willing to say out in public, Dylan Roof should not get the death penalty. But it was a harder sell, and there's gonna, then not long after that, there was a murder of many Jewish congregants at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. And then, just a few weeks ago, there were the shootings in Atlanta at a series of spas that's aimed to target Asian American victims. So those are the cases, I think, that really test our collective views on some of these subjects, where a lot of people will say, well, I'm against the death penalty, but then that case comes along and maybe it leads them to kind of question whether they're willing to support the kind of blanket ban that they may have thought they supported.
Yeah, I mean, again, that phrase, the symbolic home of retribution,
Hmm.
is long predates, this country and its existence as a sort of nation state. And I have been reading the Oresteia, which is the only surviving Greek trilogy, and it deals with cycles of retribution and murder and all the ripples of trauma. And the final part of the trilogy is the establishment of a jury.
Mm.
So literally, we've been wrestling with these questions for centuries. I think this book is just, a beautiful, beautiful example of the real life struggles. It's amazing how you've zoomed in on Texas, but I think, these stories apply more broadly to many different parts of this country, at least, and also some of those foundational questions that we ask ourselves simply as human beings. So
Hmm.
I thank you for this beautiful book. I want to turn to a few questions quickly before we are out of time. And the first question is a great one. Sherry would like to know, where does the title come from?
Oh,
Let the
that's a great
Lord
question.
sort them. Yes.
Sure. So it's a funny story, or I shouldn't use the word funny. It's a idiosyncratic story. It first came to me actually in a rap lyric. There's a rap group called Run the Jewels, and a
Okay.
version of that phrase was in one of their songs, and I found it just very evocative or powerful. And I was Googling it and learned that it had first been allegedly said during the Crusades when they were invading, a land, and the military was asking, should we try to spare certain people? And the Catholic leader who was leading that crusade said, no, kill them all. Let God sort them out. And then that phrase kind of continued to have a life in Western culture. It shows up around the Vietnam War on patches. And once that
Mm-hmm.
phrase was in my head, I actually saw it in the research. So when one prosecutor was talking about his boss in Houston, he said, "Oh yeah, Johnny was a real let the Lord sort them kind of guy." And Carla Faye Tucker, the woman we described earlier, before she went to death row, when she committed her murder, wore a T-shirt that said "Let God sort them out." So iterations of this phrase kind of exist all throughout our culture, and I liked the idea that that phrase would kind of capture the sort of sensibility that we as a country had embraced when we embraced the death penalty. I had a long time where I wrestled with the title because I found it very uncomfortable, and I would tell it to people. They would say, "What is your book called?" And I would tell them the name of the book, and I would see their eyebrows sort of wrinkle, and that made me question whether it should be the title. And I came to feel that the uncomfortableness is the point, right? That the point of this book is to challenge people to say, why did we as a country embrace this punishment? Why has it gone away? And what next? And I felt like kind of trying to capture the sensibility of that moment and that time in the title was an important way of kind of signaling to people what this book is.
Great. Roxanne is posing, an important question that we sort of vaulted over. The idea that the death penalty has a public safety value, the
Hmm.
idea that the death penalty it serves as a deterrent and therefore affects a decrease in violence. She said, do you have specifically research around the death penalty and homicides in states that do have the death penalty versus states that don't have the death penalty?
It's a great question. Thanks for that, Roxanne. So I didn't do the statistical analysis myself, but I did look at a lot of the research that's been done by criminologists. And over the last 40 years, there has never been a study that has been accepted by the kind of sociology community that shows that having the death penalty reduces the amount of crime or deters anybody from crime. Of course, this can be difficult to measure. There's a moment in the book where Fred Saman, was a longtime, somewhat famous San Antonio defense lawyer, said, well, I've never interviewed someone who said I was going to commit murder, but the death penalty deterred me, right? So sometimes it can be hard to understand what effect a public policy like this is really having in the world. However, states that don't have the death penalty often have less crime than states that do have the death penalty. Now, some people would say that means all the more so that a state that has more crime like Texas needs to have the death penalty. And people have made that argument, but it can become kind of a circular syllogistic problem, right? Where it's hard to really prove that the death penalty has a public safety value. I think it's also worth just mentioning in this context that many police chiefs, prosecutors, sheriffs, legislators have turned against the death penalty, not because they are morally opposed to it, but because it's very expensive. And they say it costs $1 million for all these appeals, for this man to live on death row, for the trial, because of all the experts that have to be involved. If we had that $1 million to fight crime, there'd be less crime, right? That if we could just move the $1 million that was used to sentence one person to death and use that on homicide prevention in our police department, we would have a better public safety outcome. There would be fewer crimes, fewer victims, and that's what we should do. So these debates are still very much in motion.
I mean, I always turn to sort of the literary and narrative question of retribution. So the death penalty obviously is the ultimate retribution. But whether we look at the Oresteia or whether we look at the Hatfield and the McCoys, what we always seem to find is that retribution never actually has an end to those cycles, and that retributive violence tends to always result in more violence. And I think one of the things that is so amazing in the book is that you really capture in such beautiful, but disturbing human terms, the ripples of trauma that the death penalty has on many, many people above and beyond the condemned. So the ripples of trauma on the families of both the victim and, the convicted, the ripples of trauma on the people who enact the death penalty, literally the people who work in the death house or work on death row. It's heartbreaking. It's heartrending. And you really depict it so beautifully in the book and so humanely, looking at all of those different actors in these situations.
Thank you for
and
that.
That's an impressive accomplishment. I think we have time for one more question before we end, and that's sort of related to the point you were just making about the literal cost. We have a question from someone who served as a spiritual advisor to a death row inmate in Florida. Florida is another state that had a lot of lynchings and imposes the death penalty a lot. Sentenced to death in 1976, and he's still on death row. What is your perspective, Maurice, on these long incarcerations on death row?
Well, I mean, I think that they somewhat dramatically illustrate the problem of the death penalty as a logical public policy. When I say that, I mean like as something that makes sense, whether or not we ascribe any moral value to it. It doesn't. If there was ever a hope that it would deter anyone, somebody spending 40 years on death row is unlikely to, sort of scare people into thinking that they're likely to actually ever be executed. But I think more to the point, it suggests that the death penalty system is kind of broken, and by the time somebody is executed, the person that's being executed is nothing like the person who committed the crime. I mean, in the Carla Faye Tucker case we described earlier, she had not been on death row for 40, 50 years, but even she had dramatically transformed. And you see in case after case that the person who committed a heinous murder then goes to death row. They're away from the cycles of poverty and violence that got them there. Death row itself has very little violence. Many of these men live in a version of solitary confinement. And often a lot of different things happen. Some of them kind of find a community with their fellow prisoners. Some of them work really hard on fighting their cases to try to get off death row. Some of them tragically succumb to kind of really severe mental illness. Some of the people who have been on death row the longest actually are people who have a severe mental illness like schizophrenia, and the law has actually said, the Supreme Court has said that you can't execute somebody with such a severe mental illness. But there's sort of no incentive for either the defense or the prosecution to push it, so the person just kind of sits there. And to me, those stories kind of make a mockery of what's supposed to be a system that does the thing it purports to be doing, right? And again, you can have the moral debate about whether to have a death penalty, but what I learned over and over with this book is that moral debate can't really be understood without a look at the actual practicalities of this system. And what actually happens is people end up on death row, and then we as a society have said, well, they have a right to a lawyer and they have a right to appeal. And these appeals go on for many, many years. And over that course of time, sometimes the courts decide this person's death sentence was violated the Constitution. This person is even innocent. Many people who are innocent have been released from death row. So that shows why we need to have that process. But then having that process means that people transform. They sit on death row for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And the person that gets executed has transformed so much that it sort of doesn't, it kind of feels meaningless. Sometimes the victim family members aren't even around anymore. So I think that these long stints on death row, like she's describing, just show how kind of broken the system is at a human level.
Yeah, and how little it serves victims as well. Yeah. I thank you so much for this wonderful book, and I really encourage folks to get it from your independent bookseller. I know you can get it via the festival. Thank you so much for writing it. It is incredibly illuminating and revealing of the changes that we've been through since the 20th century, and why there's so much room for hope for a better public policy around these questions. Thank you so much for talking with me, Maurice.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this, Piper.
It's been wonderful. And thanks for everyone who joined us.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
So long, everyone.